Mr. Berman, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We are so happy to have you here with us today and are going to ask if you could make just a few opening comments on our topic of Saudi Arabia, and then we'll start with questions.
Sure. Well, no, and thank you, Kathy, and thank you everybody for having me. It's always nice to sort of chat. I know that in your last installment you had my friend and colleague Jim Robbins on, and he talked about Iran. Jim's always a hard act to follow, but I think this is a very useful topic because it flows very naturally from the conversation about Iran. So the way I like to think about Iran is that Iran is Republican in form, but Islamic in substance, meaning it has Republican institutions and it has nominally, at least on paper, separation of powers, but the religious institutions really overlay the Republican ones, the secular ones. And so the religion drives the show. And this is, I think, a really nice entry into a discussion of Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia doesn't have those Republican institutions. Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. It has been run since the foundation of the modern Saudi state in 1932. It's been run by a dynasty, the Al Saud family, a succession of monarchs that have really controlled the contours of national politics. Political parties are not allowed in Saudi Arabia. The House of Saud really sets the contours of the national debate over politics, over religion, over society. And they do so in a way that, at least historically, has been rather exclusionary and sort of rather austere, and I would say in many ways very unhelpful for global security. You have to, in order to understand why, you have to go back to the 19th century. So in the 19th century, Saudi Arabia was not the Arabian Peninsula was a disaggregated group of tribes that the patriarch of the Al Saud clan at the time, Mohammed ibn Saud, tried to unify together. And so he was looking for glue to hold these tribes together, to essentially bind them together, to create a sense of nationality, a sense of allegiance. And that was why he made common cause. He made a partnership with an ultra-conservative cleric named Muhammad ibn Wahhab. And Wahhabism, the creed, the very austere, very extreme interpretation of Islam that Wahhab espoused, that he taught, that he proselytized on, became the foundation of the first Saudi state back in the 18th century, and of every successive Saudi state since. So we're now in the third, the modern Saudi state is considered the third Saudi state, formed in 1932, but built in a way that's somewhat recognizable, but still very much controlled by the ruling family. So Saudi Arabia today has a parliament. It's known as the Shura Council. It has two chambers. There's 180 members total, but unlike our Congress and unlike our legislative branch, all of the members of both the upper chamber and the lower chamber of the Saudi parliament are appointed by the king. So de facto, they become a rubber stamp, right? They essentially just approve the edicts that he proposes. They write them up into laws and they pass them that way. They also have a judiciary, but the judiciary, unlike ours, is not independent from the executive branch, and it's governed by Islamic law. So it's theoretically independent, but it's really subservient because the monarch gets to determine what the contours of acceptable religious debate are, and the judiciary has to enforce those rules. In terms of laws, they have, there's two, I mean, there's more than two, but there's two of consequence. There's a constitution, but unlike ours, it's based on the Quran, the Islamic holy book, and the Sunnah, which are the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. And there's a basic law, the Saudi Basic Law of Governance, which outlines the roles of government, but it makes very clear that Islamic law is supreme. So in every iteration, in every structure, in every law, there is the primacy of the Muslim faith. And that's what guides the functioning of the government. So, unlike ours, where we have separation of powers, we have judicial independence, we have proportional representation for our elected representatives, you don't have elections, you have selections. And they're not even selections from the grassroots up, they're selections from the top down, where the king and his court get to decide sort of who are not only what is acceptable in terms of the laws that govern the country, but also who is acceptable to vet those laws. And that's how they populate the parliament. But, and this is a big but, Saudi Arabia is a system in motion. And so for those of you that have been following Saudi Arabia, over the last 6 years, 7 years or so, you've seen some pretty dramatic changes that are taking place. And so I think it's necessary to sort of explain why these are happening. So historically, Saudi Arabia has been, in economic terms, a one-trick pony. Saudi Arabia is a major global producer of oil, and it rose to prominence, and the House of Saud became very wealthy as a result of Saudi oil exports. But Saudi, for a whole host of reasons, some of them being that there is at least one theory of the case that says that Saudi Arabia is not finding as much oil. Saudi Arabia is sort of, the era of peak oil in Saudi Arabia has passed. And so you're beginning to see more and more that the Saudi government is beginning to think creatively about how to remain relevant globally. So the logical product of that was that the day-to-day ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, in 2016 outlined something called Vision 2030. Vision 2030 is this sort of sweeping modernization plan. And again, it's a modernization plan, it's not a reform plan, because the goal here is not to fundamentally reorient Saudi society. That's happening incrementally. The goal here is to modernize Saudi society and the Saudi economy to make it more palatable, to attract foreign direct investment, to attract tourism. But as part of that modernization plan, there's a whole bunch of things that are happening. They've loosened restrictions, for example, on women driving, which is just in the last couple of years. They've begun to make major emphasis on incorporating women into the workforce, which is something they didn't have before. There is now a relaxation on mingling of the sexes. There's a relaxation on the traditional Islamic prohibition against alcohol. All of this is very significant, and it becomes more significant over time because these changes get locked in over time. Right? You can imagine a situation where next year, for whatever reason, the Saudis abolish the right for women to drive. But it's very hard to imagine that scenario a generation from now, because a whole generation of women will have grown up with that right. It'll be very hard, much harder to take away. Not impossible, but much harder. But all of this is being driven by a realization in Riyadh on the part of the Al Saud family that they need to modernize in order to become competitive economically in the global system, a system that's increasingly interconnected. And in order to do that, they have to make themselves more attractive to outside visitors, to outside funding, to tourism. And so this is what's happening in Saudi Arabia right now. And this is at least part of the sort of the trend line that you're seeing in the region. Saudi Arabia, is not at least not yet, is not a member of the Abraham Accords, the normalization agreements that materialized in 2020 between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Morocco and Bahrain and Sudan. But everybody that talks about the Middle East and talks about the Abraham Accords thinks that it is at least somewhat likely that the Saudis are, if not the next entrant, there will be an entrant at some point soon. All of that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. But you're beginning to see these changes regionally as sort of the politics and the security dynamic shift. But you're also beginning to see changes within Saudi Arabia that's beginning to align Saudi Arabia, open it up, align it more with the rest of the region. So hopefully that's a good overview.
That is a great overview. You said so much in just a very short amount of time. And I know we've got a lot of questions. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Janine. And Janine, we'll start with you.
Okay. Hi. Hello, everybody. Thank you for that. That's really, I really like this study because it's great to learn about how all the other countries work. And to understand who's really in control in this situation. Talk to me about women over there. What sort of rights do women have?
Sure. Well, so I think that's a great question, and I'm a big believer in the sort of the use of women as a metric for understanding where societies are heading and sort of how pluralistic their governments are. And so, because, and you sort of see this in other contexts, you see this in the context, for example, of Afghanistan and the trouble that women are having there. In Saudi Arabia, you are seeing as I said, a liberalization of the rights of women. So historically in Saudi society, it's a patriarchal society. Unmarried women were not allowed to travel unaccompanied in town in social settings. They were needed to be accompanied by a member of their family or by their husband if they were married. All of this is beginning to relax. Again, it's incremental, it takes time. But things like the integration of greater percentages of women into the Saudi workforce, things like the permission for women to drive, that's a reflection of this increasing liberalization trend that's taking place in Saudi society. It is, I think, all for the good. I think all these changes are very long overdue, but as I said, it tends to align Saudi Arabia much better with the rest of the region, where women are, if not the best performing, then among the best performing segments of societies in the Persian Gulf.
You say things are getting better, but I mean, tell me what they are and what they were. I mean, because just kind of the general notion that, oh, it's going to get better. I mean, you hear all this on the news, but what is the legitimacy? Can women leave the house alone? Do women have to wear certain garments? You said women aren't allowed to drive, but soon they're going to be. Can you be a little more specific about what the rules really, really are, and maybe what they were 10 years ago? Okay.
No. So again, right. So the preface to all this is that Saudi Arabia is a deeply conservative society. It's something that doesn't change overnight. There's lots of tribal custom. There's lots of sort of traditional religious custom. So there are restrictions and limitations on the way women dress. There have been historically restrictions on mobility for women. These are the things that are changing or relaxing, and they're relaxing a little bit for a very practical reason, because the rulers in Saudi Arabia have figured out that in order to attract investment, in order to attract international attention, they have to make their country a place that people want to visit. And no one from the West would want to visit Saudi Arabia on vacation if they couldn't go to the beach with their spouse, if they couldn't go to a restaurant and hold hands with their spouse, or whatever it is. So they figured out.
So if I interrupt you for a second, I'm sorry. Does that mean that women are not allowed to leave the house without a man? And is that still the law that they're trying to relax?
So that is still the law. That is something in motion. And again, right, it's something that is changing. So I haven't been to Saudi Arabia for a couple of years. The last time I was there, these reforms were sort of in motion. I caught them sort of in mid-stride. So I remember going to restaurants where they had sections where sort of in traditional terms, men and women were sort of segregated if they weren't married, right? You couldn't sit with someone of the opposite sex if you weren't married. But then there were sections of restaurants where there was commingling of the sexes. And which is, by the way, seems very strange to us, but it seemed at the time when I was talking to the Saudis that were taking me around, seemed very revolutionary to them, right? This was new. The prohibition on women driving is no longer in effect, right? So women can drive in Saudi Arabia. This is frankly something that is, decades upon decades upon decades overdue. And so I don't necessarily feel like we should congratulate the Saudis for enacting something they should have enacted, 75 years ago or 80 years ago. But it is a material change, because what it allows women to do in Saudi society, right? Before, women were totally dependent on the male members of their family for transportation to go to places, for the ability to leave the house. What you're now seeing is that women can leave the house by themselves because they can drive, and there's increasing integration of women into the workforce, so they actually hold jobs, right? This doesn't mean that all these traditional customs have fallen away. They haven't. But it does mean that there is at least some movement in this direction into greater liberalization.
Okay, thank you for that. And I just, in my last couple of questions here, let's talk about, obviously they're not a republic, they're not a democracy. And this is about military dictatorships and things things that are dangerous to us. Right. And now there are these that we are hot and cold with our alliances with them, and there's always been this focus on oil, and now that the oil it's going to be interesting to see the shift. But now they're doing these alliances with China, and they may start using the China's monetary system. So where's the danger of Saudi Arabia for us? Like in the Middle East and in the global, if there were a global conflict, and do they really respect America? Do they really like America? And I don't want like the politically correct answer. I mean,
Right.
it's
Oh,
just what do they really feel about republicanism and a constitutional republic, things of that nature? How are they a danger
right.
to us?
So again, you're not going to get a politically correct answer from me, but I'll just sort of I'll pitch it down the middle as I see it. So Saudi Arabia used to be a huge part of the problem. It used to be a huge part of the problem because that creed, that insular, very extreme creed of Islam known as Wahhabism, became a very significant export commodity in the 1980s and the 1990s into the 2000s. And as a result, you saw the spreading of sort of very intolerant material, the radicalization of Muslim communities globally, because the Saudis were spending a lot of money to export Wahhabi textbooks, to sort of set up Wahhabi funding for Wahhabi mosques in Europe and places like that. What's happening now is a little bit different. This is something that I've watched really closely over the last 6-7 years since the start of Vision 2030. And it's not clear exactly where it's heading, because you can't really say that Saudi Arabia is part of the solution yet, but it's clearly less part of the problem. And what I mean by this is that as part of this societal opening, what you have is a relaxation of Saudi, sort of the traditional Saudi support for extremism. You have a rollback of the funding that they've used historically to sponsor extreme groups. A good anecdote was when I was there a few years ago, I was there as part of a delegation looking at counterterrorism policy. And I had the opportunity to visit one of their showpiece rehab centers, where they had foreign fighters that had returned to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia after fighting in places like Syria and Iraq for the Islamic State. And I had the opportunity to talk with some of their administrators, and I said, candidly, I'm a guest in your country. I mean this with all due respect, but I think you have a problem. I think you have a problem because the people that you have incarcerated here, when they left half a decade ago, they thought that they ideologically were in line with sort of the ideology of the kingdom. They've come back. You've now put them behind bars, and you're trying to rehabilitate them. And I'm sure they feel like, sort of the ideological rug has been pulled out from under them. And the answer that I got was actually very interesting in response. What I heard was their ability to adapt is a good indicator for us whether or not it's possible to reintegrate them into society. So what you have is you have an absolute monarchy that is turning for its own reasons, ideologically turning in a direction. And the people that can turn with it in society are welcome, and the people that are not are going to remain behind bars. But this is sort of that abrupt pivot is what you're seeing in the context of Saudi Arabia. Now, what that actually does to the United States, what that does to the Saudi place in the world, that remains to be seen. There's the US-Saudi relationship is 75, 76 years old. There's lots of questions in Saudi Arabia about whether or not this is still a good bet, whether or not this is still a good alliance. There's lots of questions here about whether or not this is a good bet, this is a good alliance. But what you've seen, and you've seen this on the part of Republican presidents and on the part of Democratic presidents, is a retraction of American involvement in the Middle East generally, right? The US is less involved in the Middle East than it was a decade ago, than it was 2 decades ago. And so everybody in the region is making other plans. So that Saudi flirtation with China, right, manifested in greater economic involvement of China, China becoming a stakeholder in this Vision 2030 plan, what have you, is all a reflection of the fact that the Saudis are questioning their relationship with us. They don't know whether or not we're going to hang around in the region, whether or not we're going to stay, and they're beginning to make other plans. And so that's all of what you're seeing.
Really interesting. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I want to toss it over so other people have a chance to ask questions, or I could ask all day. But well said, well spoken. Appreciate your perspectives. They're very clear, and thank you so much. And I'll toss it to Tova.
Yeah, thanks so much, Janine. And thank you so much for this really fantastic overview. I have, I'm brimming with questions, so to jump right in. As I was mentioning a bit before the call, so as Saudi Arabia is now attempting to open up and modernize to the rest of the world, do we sort of see a trade-off between wanting to be more modern and engage in the international community with sort of their authoritarian hold on power, especially with regards to their religious legitimacy? As you mentioned, the foundation of their state was in their partnership with Wahhabi, Islamists, and a lot of their legitimacy rests on being, the religious authority in the state. And now, as they're loosening these strict Wahhabi religious norms with regards to women's rights and alcohol consumption and everything like that, could it possibly threaten their relationship to more stringent religious authorities and their legitimacy that way? Or just more broadly, as they try to engage with the international community, there's certain norms that they might have to abide by, and is going to weaken their strict, authoritarian holds over their country.
Right. No. I think really that's the central question, because what you see in Saudi Arabia is a reform process, but it's comparatively new, right? So the modern Saudi state's been around since 1932. This reform plan's only been sort of in motion over the last 6-7 years. And it's very fragile, meaning that it's being driven by the persona, by the authority of the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. But he's driving it despite the fact that Saudi Arabia is a very conservative society, right? So nothing succeeds like success. So if this reform plan brings dividends in the form of greater Western investment, brings dividends in the form of greater Saudi integration into the international community, greater tourism, greater technological advances, then everything's great, because it's sort of a proof of concept that he was actually right. Where the danger kicks in is if that very conservative Saudi society begins to look askance at him and say, hey, you know what? Like we really haven't benefited a lot from all these changes that you've made. We want to go back to the old ways. I think that chapter hasn't been written yet, but that's certainly one to watch. And you can sort of, the thing that I worry about when I look at Saudi Arabia is I intrinsically, because I'm American and because I sort of, very, very much value the US system, I'm intrinsically nervous about personality politics, about countries where there are larger than life personalities that in their absence, the country could go in a fundamentally different way, right? I mean, so think Vladimir Putin in Russia, think Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, right? These are people who are, so large in our imagination that we sort of boil down our whole understanding of the country just to these people. So the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is one of those people. If you pluck him out of the equation, the future for Saudi Arabia becomes a lot more murky. It's not clear that they'll continue their reforms. It's not clear that they'll continue this trajectory of opening up. So that worries me. I would be much more comfortable with a more institutionalized Saudi process that isn't linked to one personality, that's sort of more spread across, that there's a sort of a state commitment to this opening up. But in order to see that, I think we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. And then do you have any sort of awareness of how strong or stable the monarchy is among Saudi people? Like what is popular opinion? I mean, I'm sure it would be difficult to get these true statistics, but what is the perception of public opinion? And then, with these reforms, are people generally excited about them, or are they sort of being viewed with suspicion?
So I think a bit of both. As you said, it's hard in all authoritarian regimes. It's hard to get to the bottom of sort of what the people actually think, among other things, because if you live in an authoritarian state and somebody calls you and they say, "Hey, what do you think? How do you think the government's doing?" There's only one answer that won't get you into trouble, right? There's only one answer. So all of these numbers are a little mushy, but even within that uncertainty, you can see that the plan is somewhat controversial, right? So in monarchies, in monarchies populate the Middle East and Africa, in a lot of monarchies, the power and the prestige of the office of the monarch actually carries a lot of weight. Someplace like where you and I have been, someplace like Morocco, the power of the king, because he's seen as a benign ruler, it goes a long way towards injecting legitimacy into something that he proposes, right? Because it's the king, he proposes. Saudi Arabia, it's a little bit different. I think the House of Saud is not seen so unequivocally as a benign monarch, but there is still a lot of trust and a lot of nationalism on the part of Saudis as to their conception of the House of Saud. So my sense is, sort of going back to my answer to your previous question, I think a lot of it depends on how these reforms perform, because if they perform well, it buttresses the authority of the crown prince. If they perform poorly, if Saudi Arabia is disadvantaged as a result, for example, then it's really hard to make the sale to the Saudi people, who are of two minds about this opening up anyway, that this is really a good path to continue down.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I definitely run through living in Morocco. The king was viewed like, I didn't expect him to be viewed so positively among the people I talked to. Not just like the, State Department people you talk to, but just like the everyday people coming from America. And like, no, we threw the monarch's tea in the Boston Harbor, but people were, generally viewed it as this like legitimate institution. I remember for the holiday of Eid, we all gathered around the television to watch the king, sacrifice the animal for the holiday. And this was like a thing that people did as like a symbol of their country. So yeah, interesting to see how that compares in Saudi Arabia. And then I guess my follow-up question is, in a country like Saudi Arabia, where there aren't free and fair elections, where the legislature is appointed by the king, how important is public opinion? Is it less important than in, a country like the US, where people directly hold their officials accountable? And, in a basically autocratic country, what is still the importance of how your people view you if you're not electorally responsible for them?
Right. So I mean, clearly less important than the United States, right? The U.S. is, if not the purest, one of the purest examples of the ordinary citizen being able to sort of, over time and incrementally, and depending on how loud his or her voice is and how many friends he or she can bring to the polling place, to really sort of shift politics on a national level, right? I'm a sort of the remedial civics lesson that we all got in high school, I think, is very important. It's something that we sort of, I try to enshrine in my kids, and it's something that frankly doesn't translate into the Saudi system. It doesn't translate into the systems of a lot of monarchies, but that doesn't mean that monarchs are completely unaccountable to the people. We are past, right? So a couple 100 years ago, 300 years ago, in places like Europe, the monarch was completely unaccountable. The monarch had essentially his own Praetorian Guard. He could do whatever he wanted. He would tax his serfs, everything. There was no sort of proportional representation. I think even in Saudi Arabia, but certainly in places like Morocco that you mentioned, that's a little bit changed now, right? So the modern monarchy, its viability, its stability depends on it being seen as contributing to the overall welfare of the country. This doesn't mean that they're not fabulously wealthy. They are. This doesn't mean that they don't have their own pet projects. They do. But what it means is that if a monarch, including the Saudi monarch, takes the country down a rabbit hole that the people fundamentally reject, completely sort of reject, what you'll see is a tremendous amount of domestic instability. And so a lot of these changes that are taking place in the Middle East, what you've seen over the last couple of years, the reason it's so important is because it's been so rapid. Because monarchs in the modern era, for a long time, they figured out that if they want to move the ship of state moves slowly. We have to do it incrementally. The changes that we've seen just in the last 3 or 4 years, in terms of normalization, in terms of greater trade, greater tourism, this is a new era that we're looking at in the Middle East. But it's a new era that also creates a lot of opportunity for countries if they want to seize it. And so the Saudis, who began their intellectual pivot before any of this happened in the Middle East, they were sort of, having the gut check moment internally before the rest of the region was, are looking at what's happening, what's changing in the region, and trying to figure out the proper path. That proper path, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean that it makes them more aligned with the United States. In fact, you can make the argument that, because America's receding, it's over the horizon in the Middle East. We're focused on China, we're focused on great power competition, we're in other parts of the world, that the reason the Saudis are cozying up to the Chinese is that they're trying to make other plans, and they understand the region's changing rapidly, and we're nowhere to be found. The traditional allies nowhere to be found. But all of this is being done as a reflection of a domestic need for change. So there is some organic tissue that connects the people to the monarch. It's not the way it was 300 years ago, but far less than there is in the United States than there are in Western democracies.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And then moving on to a sort of different angle, we've talked about Iran last year, and you did a bit of or last, chat, but you did a bit of a comparison as well. But could you generally give an overview of why Iran and Saudi Arabia are such political foes? And then also talking a bit about the Sunni nature of Saudi Arabia versus the Shiite nature of Iran, and how does that religious difference influence government, other than, of course, the religious doctrines? Do you think whether a country is Sunni or Shiite, does that develop how the political nature of things runs, how the institutions develop? Any sort of difference there?
So you're singing my song. My only challenge is to try to, do a pithy answer, because this is like a semester-long course. But the magic number that you guys need to know is 1.8, 1.9 billion, right? That's the number of, and again, right, so the number's a little fuzzy, but that is the estimated number of Muslims in the world, right? Islam is the world's fastest growing faith. The Muslims make up 1.8, 1.9 billion people. So the percentages break down pretty dramatically, right? 85% of Muslims are Sunni, 15% are Shiite, right? Saudi Arabia is Sunni, the United Arab Emirates is Sunni, Morocco is Sunni, right? A whole bunch of other countries are Sunni. Iran is Shiite. So a lot of that competition, and again, right, sort of that division goes way back into the sort of, the formative generations after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and competing interpretations of the Quran, and, succession and who's going to lead. But fast forward into the modern era, and what you have is you have a geopolitical struggle between the Sunni world and the Shiite world. And this is new. This is new as a result of the creation of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Because historically, if you're in a minority the way the Shiites were in a minority, what you tended to do was to be sort of quiescent, to be quiet, to sort of not be involved in politics. And so there were Shiite minorities in many, many countries in the Middle East, but they tended not to be involved in politics. All of this changed in 1979 when the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini came back to Iran from exile and led the Islamic Revolution. And his big value proposition was, he was telling the Shiites, hey, listen, I know that you guys are sort of, keeping your powder dry. You're not involved in politics, but follow me, and I will be sort of your steward, right? So what he did was he took a fairly inert global religious community and transformed it into a political community, right? And this was something this is what sort of animates the Islamic Republic of Iran. This is why in Iran, there are two titles in the Persian language. There are two titles for the leader of the country. There's the Rahbar, which is the political leader, and there's the Marja Taqlid, which is the model of religious emulation under Shiite Islam. And for a long time, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who died in 1989, he was both, right? So he was sort of Mr. Iran, because he controlled both the politics and the religion. Now Khomeini died in 89. There is a successor to him, but he lacks at least part of the religious gravitas. And so there is a ideological competition that's underway in the Muslim world about who's going to lead. It's a competition between the majority, the Sunnis, and the minority, the Shiites. And it's about, who gets to speak for Islam, what is the correct interpretation of Islam, right? But it has all sorts of contemporary political overtones, because it's not just about the religion and the faith. It's also about who's the dominant power in the Middle East. It's also, overlaid by things like Iran's nuclear program and things like that, right? So, but it makes the whole scenario very, very complicated. That's why a couple months ago, when Saudi Arabia signed a normalization deal with Iran, it was such a big deal, right? This was a Chinese brokered deal. The two haven't had diplomatic relations for a long time because they're essentially regional rivals. It was a sort of a reflection of the fact that the Saudis, they have other priorities. They are working on development, they're working on international integration, and they understand that Iran can be a spoiler for them. So they were looking to the Chinese to sort of broker this understanding, right? Doesn't mean they're going to be friends. And there's lots of questions about whether this agreement will actually hold. But it is a reflection of the fact that the Saudis understand that the region is changing, and they're trying to shift their policy so that this geopolitical competition is not the alpha and the omega of everything that they're doing. Sorry, that was a lot, but
No, please. I wish we had 10 hours to talk about this. This is amazing. And I could ask more, but I want to pass on to the next person. But thank you so much for being here and for all your expertise.
All right, so I bet it'll ask a bunch more questions that you won't be able to answer in this amount of time, but this has certainly been informative, and thank you. So can you quickly tell me, who is the Sunni leader, religious leader, a single person for all Sunnis, and what is that person's role or title?
okay, so no, there's not a single leader. Islam as a religion is flat in the sense that there's not a hierarchy of sources, right? That doesn't mean that there aren't Islamic scholars. There certainly are, but in terms of authority, it has tended to be flat, and the only people that rise above, the only people that sort of command greater authority, are people like the King of Morocco, the King of Jordan, right? There's a very small group of families that can trace their lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad, right? Directly, right? And it gives them gravitas to be able to speak with greater authority, at least, on questions of Islam. But part of the problem that we've had historically about Islamic interpretation has been that anybody with the equivalent of a master's degree or a religious degree or whatever it is can arrogate power to themselves to espouse a very exclusionary interpretation of Islam, right? This is exactly what Osama bin Laden did in the context of him creating the worldview for Al-Qaeda, right? So these leaders, these moderate Muslim thought leaders, are enormously important, right? And there's others as well. They don't just have to come from these families. There's a whole corpus of people in places like Egypt and Indonesia and in the countries of Central Asia, right? The majority of Muslim countries of Central Asia, where there are scholars that are working overtime to try to reshape sort of the interpretation of the religion in a more pluralistic direction, right? This is
so
all
hard to
sorry, go ahead.
so that's so interesting, but it's also so hard to understand because it's on such a large scale, and
That's
because religious and political power are so unified in the Islamic world, so that even becomes more so everything that you're saying carries more weight for those people who have risen, because Islam doesn't separate so cleanly or at all political and religious power. So as a way of almost thinking of it, that religious leaders gather followers more of the way of like American Protestantism or non-denominational Christian churches, where there's somebody, as a mosque would happen, where there's preaching and they would just gain more followers there and gain more power in that way in a if we're speaking strictly about like a mosque.
So I think that's a good question. I advisedly, the answer is I don't know. I'm Jewish, so I have no basis to compare. I can tell you that sort of from my experience, from my travels in the Middle East, you get a little bit of both, right? What you get is you can have in very sort of developed religious countries in the Middle East, countries where the religion of Islam is sort of very developed, it's very variegated. You can have sort of local flavors of Islam, right? And sort of different mosques and different authorities. In other places, and even in unexpected places like Latin America, the adherence to Islam is almost seen as an alternative identity. You reject the state, you become a Muslim or whatever it is, right? It's less about a specific preacher or a specific interpretation or a church or whatever it is. It's more a sort of an identity, a way of thinking. This is sort of to your point, this makes it really complicated for all of these Islamic leaders, leaders in the Muslim world, right? Who are trying to do two things simultaneously. They're trying to be modern statesmen and stateswomen, right? Who are guiding their state, who are providing advantages to their constituents, but they need to stay within the sort of the contours, the guidelines of the religion. Otherwise, they're seen as being illegitimate, right? A lot of the Arab Spring that took place 12 years ago or so in the Middle East and North Africa was about that. It was about leaders that were acting, Muslim leaders that were acting secularly, but they had sort of, they'd lost the threat. They'd sort of lost the connection with the people. So this is something that's I think looked at very very carefully by modern Muslim leaders in Africa and the Middle East. It's also something that there's a whole corpus of people that are connected to clerical institutions in Egypt, Lebanon, all these other countries, Bahrain, the Emirates, Morocco, that are working to shape the contours of religious discourse, because they figured out that it's bad for the brand to have people like the Islamic State or people like Al-Qaeda speaking for 1.8 billion people, right? It's bad for the brand because it creates all this friction and tension. And
yeah, and then there's two quick questions with that. Number one, are the Saudi leaders also seen as how you mentioned the King of Morocco or Jordan? Do they have the religious gravitas? And then secondly, is there any concern that it will increase radicalism as a reaction to an attempted modernization?
Right. So second question first. I think the answer is absolutely. What I think we all should be worried about is, Saudi Arabia is undergoing this pretty significant internal shift, and it's a shift that's going to have it's going to have a lot of resistance from ultra-conservative elements of Saudi society, right? Ultra-conservative elements that could take matters into their own hands. This is why I worry about the Crown Prince sort of doing this alone without reorienting the state as a larger whole in doing it. Remind me, what was your first question again?
Kind of right with that. So then does he have the religious gravitas like a leader of maybe how you mentioned Jordan, so that he could make a religious claim to why this is good?
Right. So yes and no. So the House of Saud does not trace its lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad. However, Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the two holy places, right, in Islam, Mecca and Medina. So they, by geography, they have legitimacy, right? Because the annual Muslim pilgrimage known as the Hajj, it takes place to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis get to be the de facto gatekeepers of a very important religious ritual that gives them enormous standing. And remember, and everybody sort of forgets about this, but remember that the Muslim world is a lot of people, right? 1.8, 1.9 billion people, but most of it is actually not in the Middle East. There's only 400 million people in the Middle East. There's over 1 billion Muslims in Asia, right? The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia. It's 270 million people. And you add to that Pakistan. You add to that India, even though India is not a Muslim nation. India is so big, it's 1.4 billion people. They have 300 million Muslims, right? So you start adding that, and what you end up with is that most of the Muslim world is not the way we generally think about it in the Middle East, right? But our conception of the religion of Islam is overwhelmingly Middle Eastern based. It's all about Saudi Arabia. It's all about the Gulf. It's all about Iran. In that way, all these other Muslims, Muslims in Malaysia and Indonesia and all these other places, they tend to feel sidelined, because the way they look at the religion, the way they interpret the religion is seen as being on the periphery. It's not seen as being in the center of discourse. So that's really something interesting to watch, right? As somebody who sort of spends a lot of time traveling and talking to these people, watching these different models, the models of how you take the religion and you sort of apply it to the state, how you modernize the state and, still remain faithful, but sort of, make the state high performing economically, make the state a representative of its people, right? Everybody has a different mousetrap. It's not just the Saudi model. And so this is, I think, one of the interesting things to watch.
And thank you.
Well, and thank you for those great questions, Jewel and Jorn and Tova and Janine. And we have some audience questions as well. And first of all, we want to give a shout out to our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. KKVV airs our podcast Monday nights at 6 p.m. Pacific. So we're glad to have our podcast airing on KKVV. We also want to recognize students with Permian High School and Bob Brescia who are watching today, and Cherie Stiegel, and with 3 homeschool students, and the Wanhouse family with some homeschool students. And Kenyon Wanhouse, age 14, asks, what are the consequences for the U.S. with Saudi Arabia moving closer to China?
Wow, it's a great question. So I'll get there in a second, but sort of the first 30 seconds on what we're actually seeing. We're having a little bit of a sort of revolution in the way we think about China, right? The awareness that China is not a benign actor in global affairs is actually very new, right? For a long time, for a quarter century or so, we thought basically that the more we trade with China, the more we integrate China into things like the UN and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, we could basically trade them into them becoming a democracy, right? And what we figured out is that that's actually not happening. The Chinese are perfectly happy to trade, but they have their own worldview, they have their own sort of ideological model. And under their current president, Xi Jinping, they've embarked upon a much more sort of aggressive, forward-leaning, adventurous foreign policy, right? This is where all that tension comes from that you see in US-Chinese relations. So the reason I explain it this way is because for a long time, we didn't fully appreciate how China was moving around the globe, right? We just assumed that China was sort of talking to everybody the way we were talking to everybody, that they weren't weren't embarking upon a grand strategy. But what we've discovered is that the Chinese are in the Middle East in a much more organic and a much deeper way than we historically have paid attention to, right? They're talking not just to the Saudis, they're talking to the Iranians, they're talking to a whole bunch of other Gulf countries as well, but they are investing very heavily in the Persian Gulf. They are investing a lot of resources. They have become a key stakeholder in this Vision 2030 plan on the part of Saudi Arabia. And it has the potential over time, right? It doesn't mean that the Saudis are going to kick their American habit overnight, right? I think the sort of, America has a lot of selling points. I don't think the relationship goes away overnight. But it is concerning. Because what you have is and it's not just Saudi Arabia, but what you have is Saudi and a whole bunch of other countries that are increasingly beholden to Chinese money in a way that makes them less reliable allies of the United States. And there's an interesting tension that exists between this administration and the last administration. What's the proper way to think about China? Do we, are they an adversary? Are they a competitor? What do we do? Because we can't compete with Chinese money, right? We can't throw billions upon billions of dollars at Saudi Arabia, nor should we. But how do we remain competitive? What do we do here, right? I'm a big believer in the fact that, sort of the intrinsic appeal of the United States is our values, is our sort of the vibrancy of our society. But advisedly, the things that make us unique may not be the things that attract other countries to us, right? You can have, in the Middle East, you can have a lot of authoritarian regimes, and you see this certainly in the case of Iran, where the government is perfectly happy to remain authoritarian. They're not interested in liberalizing. And in that case, China for them is a much safer bet, because China for them is value-free investing. They're getting money from China. China's not telling them to do better on human rights. China's not telling them that they have to open up their institutions and their society. And this is important in the case of Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is in the middle of a transition from that old model to maybe something else. And so what I worry about is that Chinese money could interrupt or slow down that process, right? Chinese influence, Chinese investment could make the Saudis less reformist than they are currently. So.
That's really interesting. And that may answer partially Elise Rivas's question on how do the Chinese think about the Muslim religious politics and their international interactions with Saudi Arabia, disrespect or respect. Are you saying that the Chinese are fairly neutral in their attitudes towards?
So this is a large, I know we only have like 3 minutes. So this is a much larger conversation, and anybody who's watching, I urge you to do some of your own reading on the plight of the Uyghurs, the Uyghur Muslim minority in China, right? China has a Muslim minority of several million people in the west of China. They're being repressed horribly, but they're being repressed horribly almost without comment from the Muslim world, right? So this is the really dangerous lesson that China is learning from its engagement in the Middle East is if it can spread its money around, if it can buy off all these countries are not going to object when it represses its own population, right? And there's practical reasons for this, right? The Emirates or Bahrain or whoever it is, they're not really going to by themselves change China's policy. So why would they forego Chinese investment just to sort of to take a stand? But it does create a real problem, because the lesson the Chinese are learning is that they can do whatever they want, including to their own Muslim minority, without facing repercussions from the international community, as long as they're spreading their money around.
Well, thank you. And then Lawson Barclay, who actually is one of our, we have a We the Future contest, and we have a category for senior citizen essay, and Lawson is one of our senior citizen essay winners. But Lawson asks, as the U.S. is still dependent on foreign oil, why has the relationship cooled between the U.S. and Saudi? Why is U.S. influence decreasing in the area? Why is the U.S. withdrawing as an active participant in the area? And with the first Gulf War, Saudi became very close to the U.S. Now that relationship has cooled off. Can you comment?
Well, that's a lot. So yes, very quickly I can comment. So the U.S. is still dependent on foreign oil, but it's significantly less so, right? The U.S. has had, over the last several years, has had a revolution in terms of energy. It's become a net exporter of energy, right, as a result of shale oil. There's also, right, and this has had the effect in some corners of saying, hey, listen, we don't need to be so involved in parts of the world where we were involved before, including in the Middle East. Right, because we're talking about the Constitution, we're talking about America. This is where national politics really matters, right? Because it's all about regulation and deregulation. It's all about, do we want to be energy independent, or do we want to sort of become reliant, right? And so this is a conversation that's ongoing right now. But the practical effects are that the U.S. has, over time, retracted from the Middle East. There's another thing that's happening as well, and this goes all the way back to 2010, 2011, when the Obama administration at that time was looking at a very volatile region, right? It was a region that was being convulsed by the Arab Spring. It was a region where the Iranian nuclear program was out of the box, and they didn't quite know what to do. And so they articulated a pivot to Asia, because at that time, China was not the China that we see now, right? I mean, it was, but we sort of didn't see it as such. Asia was seen as an area, as a global region of great opportunity. And so President Obama evangelized the idea of a pivot, right? You turn away from the Middle East, you turn towards Asia as an area of primary focus, right? And that focus has persisted. And now that we see China for what it really is, that focus is really getting locked in. And as a result, there's not that much appetite to turn our attention back to the Middle East, right? And everybody in the region, including historic allies like Saudi Arabia, are sensing our inattention.
Well, thank you. And that is a great way to wrap up. And we just really appreciate your time. And you're so knowledgeable on this. And I know I've learned so much. And I think everyone in our audience did today as well. And Janine, any closing comments? And maybe not Tova, Jewel, or Jewel?
Thank you so much. There's so much information. That was like a mini college course. So thank you.
I aim to please.
Yes, thank you so much for being on. This was great. Hope you join us again soon. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
A pleasure.
Yes, and this is Janine. Thank you. I could not find the Zoom icon to hit the unmute button. So sorry. Thank you so much. Terrific, terrific show. Appreciate it very much.
Yes, and we want to thank our audience and invite you back next week, Tuesday, 2 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about North Korea. So thank you. Bye.